In March of 1942, 227 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes on Bainbridge Island by the U.S. Army. Clarence Moriwaki will share the story of Bainbridge Island, the origin point of the Japanese American exclusion, to provide a human, historical account of this national tragedy, and to ask the question, are there parallels to what's happening in America now? Moriwaki is the president of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community and a founder and former president of Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial Association. He's written guest editorials on the subject that have been published nationwide. Moriwaki has served as a spokesperson for the administrations, including the Clinton administration, the Officer of the Governor, and Congressman and Governor Jay Inslee. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really very eager to hear what you have to say today, Clarence. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to Arts and Humanities Bainbridge for inviting me to share this presentation. And let me cue her up here for you. And I call this the presentation of 4 H's, history. Well, first of all, this is a PowerPoint presentation. I want to warn you ahead of time. So all of those who have done PowerPoint, watched PowerPoint, or had to produce one, you know how PowerPoint works. And so I hope that you will find that my presentation won't be torturous. I call this the presentation of 4 H's, history, honor, healing, and hope. First, we have to start for the history in our region, and that is to the Suquamish people who had been in this area for about 10,000 years. The picture above on the right shows a salmon being on somewhere on Eagle Harbor, and they had a long history of leadership in this region, including its most famous son, Chief South. And Chief South is the namesake for the city of Seattle. The first Europeans arrived in 1792. This is an artist's depiction of the HMS Discovery, headed by Captain George Vancouver. And in 1841, the United States Navy came to Central Puget Sound. Navy Lieutenant Charles Wilkes came, circumnavigated our island, and then named it after his good friend Commodore William Bainbridge, who never set foot in Washington State. When they came to the region, what they discovered were massive natural resources, the old growth forest from Canada all the way down to Northern California. This is kind of a middle-aged cedar, maybe only about 400 years old. They were up to a millennia old, and anywhere there was near a coast or these large trees, people made mills. Here in Bainbridge Island, the Blakely Harbor Mill at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, was the largest lumber mill in the entire world, bringing people in from all around the world, from Croatia, Sweden, Japan, Norway, and the rest working together. And in the background, that's not a bunch of burned down trees, but that's the Hall Brothers shipyard. And they were also building the largest ships in the world at that time, 3, 4, 5-masted schooners. This brought in all the people to work in the businesses. At its peak, there were about 3,000 people who were working within Blakely Harbor, both at the mill and at the shipyard. And in the 1880s, the Census Bureau came through to the area, but they found names like mine, Moriwaki or Yamamoto, too hard to spell or to pronounce. So they simply, for many years, if I was there, I might be known as simply Jap number 35. This is a depiction of what Port Blakely looked like in its peak. You can see on the map the Hall Brothers shipyard near the mouth of the harbor. Going into the harbor, you can see the mill near the log pond. I'm going to focus on the lower left corner of this map, the Japanese towns of Yama and Nagaya. Nagaya was where the first workers came, the men came who worked in the mills and also the shipyard. When they brought over their families, they started to go into building their own homes up the hill, Yama, which means mountain or hill in Japanese. And that's where the families gathered. And here's a depiction of here's a picture of Yama. At its peak, there were about 300 Japanese on Bainbridge Island out of an island of about 3,200. So it's about 10% of the population. The Japanese came because of an economic recession in the 1880s and afterwards. And many of them worked at the mill and worked at the shipyard, as I mentioned, but many of them were also business people and entrepreneurs. So they started basically the company town with the Washington Hotel, a restaurant, bathhouse, mercantile store. This is Mr. Takeyoshi's mercantile business. There was also one business that was very, very popular that everybody frequented, and that was the ice cream store. By bringing these businesses in, patronized the Japanese American businesses. That created this really tight-knit community on Bainbridge. But the mill burned down in the 1920s. It burned down twice, and so the Japanese and everybody else had to find something else to do. A lot of the Japanese took surplus World War I dynamite and blew up the stumps and started strawberry fields. It was some of the most productive strawberries in the entire region. And they also started businesses. This is a picture of the grocery store at was then Bainbridge Gardens. Mr. Harui is on the right. They also had a gas station. Of course, Bainbridge Gardens that exists today was also a big nursery at the time. And again, everybody shopped locally and they shopped within our ecosystem of an island. So it was a very tight-knit community. Another thing that made us very tight-knit was we had compulsory public education in Washington State, which means every child must go to school. And I would contend that no child is born prejudiced. So that also was this tight-knit community. Then 79 years ago today, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the naval installation, the 7th Fleet. And on that day and the day after, the FBI went not only through Hawaii, but they went to 23 cities in the continental US and took whatever they wanted without search warrants, without any effort. They just did it and arrested about 1,291 elders throughout the country. On February 4th, the FBI came to Bainbridge Island, did a similar raid with the assistance of all the Kitsap County sheriffs and deputies and the Washington State Patrol, and hit all 50 homes simultaneously, again, without search warrants, without a charge, without any, you just did it. Here's a map of what that looked like on December 9th. You can see the depiction of the cities and how many people they arrested from each of these communities that they went to in the continental US. And on December 11th, a few days after Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Western Defense Command is created. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, pictured here, was the first commander. And in March 2nd, he issued Public Proclamation number 1. It designated military areas on the western halves of California, Washington, and Oregon, and parts of Arizona. They had a curfew imposed just for people of Japanese ancestry, not for Italian Americans or German Americans. And all of the Japanese had to remain in their homes at 8 in the evening and could not come out till 6 in the morning. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on February 19th, 1942, signed Executive Order 9066. It established the War Relocation Authority, a civilian agency in charge of managing the incarceration camps, and he appoints Milton Eisenhower as its first director. About a month and a week after that, on March 24th, soldiers from New Jersey arrived on the island and they put up posters for Civilian Exclusion Order number 1. And it said all persons of Japanese ancestry will be removed in 6 days. You will only be allowed to take what you could carry or wear. 3 families moved most like prior to the forced removal. And everybody was also ordered to show up at the Anderson Hardware Store, which is now the Pegasus Coffee Shop. And everybody had to come in person, including children and their babies, to monitor all of those folks. That poster was put up on March 24th. This picture was taken a day after that on March 25th. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Evansto Oroto, and they're smiling in this photograph, but I suspect shortly after this photograph was taken, they were not, because Mr. Oroto was told he could not go with his wife because he was Filipino-American and Miki was Japanese-American. And I'm told that he was really sad about that he was willing to renounce his citizenship because he wanted to go with his wife, but the soldier said, no, you are not a Japanese American, so you have to stay behind. They had 6 days to figure out what to do. This is the Suimatsu signing over their property, and on Bainbridge Island, because of the tight-knit nature we had, almost everybody who owned property found a neighbor who would look after their property. This is very unusual. It does not happen up and down the West Coast very often. And so there are a lot of properties that were waiting for them. And finally, on that day, March 30th, 1942, the ferry was arrived. And if you could not get to the ferry dock, which is going to be gathering at the Eagle Dell Ferry Dock, this is the Winslow Ferry Dock, they would take you in a troop carrier provided here by the US government, and all people had to go. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Moji. They're a childless couple. He's in his 50s, she's in her 40s. Being taken by the soldiers. Not sure why they never had children, but they always had one wonderful dog. This is King, that's white Samoyed, as their child, if you will. Everybody knew King. He was told to be very kind. People could never bark, never bit, and He jumped into the truck because he wanted to go with his parents, if you will. Shortly after this photograph was taken, the two soldiers standing there tried to remove King. For the first time in his life, he barked and tried to bite them. They had to restrain him as the truck was being taken away. The Mojis, like many of the other families, had a neighbor who would look after their property and also promised to look after King. But King was so despondent that he refused to eat or drink, and he died in about a week. People, the families got together. These are pictures of the students saying goodbye to them at the ferry dock. The soldiers, again, became very close to all of the people on the island over those 6 days. This is a picture of one of those soldiers, Walt Woodward, who was the editor and publisher of the Bainbridge Review, as it was called, interviewed the commanding officer of this unit, and he was quoted saying, "We don't know why we're here. We don't know why we're doing it to these people. This is the hardest thing we've ever had to do." And Woodward also noted that every soldier had tears in their eyes. So the ferry was about to arrive, and the far left of this picture would be the Eagle Dell ferry dock. You can notice the soldiers marching down to meet it, and the Japanese Americans gathered by their cars and the trucks up above with their friends. The ferry Colocan arrived at 11:02. They started to board the ferry, 227 Japanese Americans. They went down, and this is Fumiko Kura, and she's saying goodbye to the island. They arrived in Seattle. All 227,000 of people watched them saying goodbye. And you can see here, they arrived and went for 3 days and 2 nights. And with their blinds closed, they arrived here in Lone Pine, California. From there, they boarded buses, rode another 2 hours, and they finally showed up at here, Manzanar, the Manzanar concentration camp under construction. So we're the first community to go to a concentration camp. All 10 concentration camps, this camp you can see in the picture here, April 2nd, 1942. They arrived on April 1st, 1942, April Fool's Day. You can see the barracks under construction here. The barracks were 100 feet by 20 feet, broken up into 4 sections, so that'd be 25 by 20. A group up to 8 people, a family, mixed family of strangers would be in that 20 by 25 area. You had the bare cots, and every person, and 1 light bulb and 1 wood stove or oil stove. All the people who showed up were first given a large sack, told to fill them up with straw in the smaller sack as well. And that would serve as your mattress, and the smaller one would be your pillow. You tried to make do with what they had. Now, of course, you can see how these young men dealt with their belongings. This is a picture of the model of Manzanar at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, California. By September of 42, more than 10,000 Japanese Americans lived in these 504 barracks. They were organized into 36 blocks, as you can see there. And in the middle of those blocks, you see 2 smaller buildings. That would be the male and female separated latrines and showers. The longer building in the middle would be the mess hall, and then the smaller one next to it would be where they did their laundry. All of them are in desolate locations. They all had very hot summers, very arid, windstorms, dust storms into the winter, just the opposite, freezing cold. Of course, no pavement, let alone gravel, so it was all muddy. These are not insulated buildings. It was a very rough life for them, both in the summertime and the wintertime. One of the things that was also a shocking change for them was the lack of privacy. This is a latrine facility. The showers are also open and shared. And especially for the first generation Japanese Americans, the Issei, privacy was a big thing to have, your dignity, and it's being modest. And for having to be with a bunch of strangers, either in the latrine or in the showers, was difficult. All 10 camps had different stories, but one story that is shared universally was people remember seeing an elder person walk out to the latrines 2 or 3 in the morning. It's not that these elder people were noisy or anything. It's because when you're at the camp, the searchlights went across the windows all the time. And when they saw someone move, they would spotlight that person as if they were on the middle of a Broadway stage. And so people would notice that, and they'd watch a person go to the latrine, wait for them to come out, and watch them come back to their barracks. And they did this because it was the one time they could have some dignity and be alone and be taking care of their business. Another thing that they found, especially the elders, was eating together. That's a Japanese tradition to eat as a family together, but now you're with a bunch of strangers and other families from who knows where. The children started to go to other barracks, though. They met other friends, they went to other blocks where the food was better or the boys and girls were cuter or whatnot. And for the most part, the elders let them do that because they wanted their children to have as normal a life as possible because they did not know how long they'd be here, if they'd even get to go back home. So they tried to make life just like it would be outside of the barbed wire. A big deal that they wanted to make sure happened was education, which is key within the Japanese American community. They created barracks, classrooms out of barracks, also having as many activities, music and dances, and trying to make life as normal again for their children. Big thing also was sports. Here's girls playing basketball outside at the Manzanar concentration camp. But the one thing the 10 camps had, and every camp had something different, but all 10 camps loved baseball. And it was the national pastime, and they would make their own diamonds. And there was a way that brought all these people together. Here is the location area. Now, this map shows the red line starting in Canada through Washington, follows the bend of the Columbia River, goes through eastern Oregon to Hood River and to Bend, Oregon, all of California and southwestern Arizona. If you're on the west side of this border I just described in that darker pink area, and of 1/16 Japanese ancestry, you are going to be excluded from the West Coast and taken to one of the 10 triangles or one of the 10 concentration camps that you can see as far east as Arkansas. Another 6,000 children would be born during the 3 years of incarceration. So all told, 120,000 Japanese Americans were placed in these areas. That was about, and excluded from the West Coast, that was about 95% of all people of 1/16 Japanese ancestry in the continental US. There are no mass exclusion orders for Italians or Germans. Number one, that would have been probably impossible. And that's about 14 million people even then. 10 million Germans, about 4 million Italian Americans. There were about 10,000 Germans and about 4,000 Italian Americans arrested, but all of them were suspected of, charged with, or convicted of some sort of crime against the nation or some sort of crime of espionage or sabotage or something like that. Not one Japanese American was ever charged with any crime. And as I mentioned, the Bainbridge Islanders first went to the Manzanar concentration camp. Lily Kitamoto Kadama, who was 7 years old, said, yeah, the concentration camp wasn't great, but at least we didn't have to go to an assembly center. And these were makeshift places because they could not build those 10 triangles earlier, those 10 concentration camps fast enough. So these were temporary holding facilities to hold people until they could have those camps completed. Here in Washington State, in orange, the Seattle, Pierce County areas, they went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. And in dark blue, Kitsap and most of King County went to the Pinedale Assembly Center outside of Fresno. In green, the rest of Western Washington went to the Tule Lake Assembly Center in Northern California, which later became a full-blown concentration camp. In Eastern Washington, they went to the Portland, Oregon Fairgrounds. There was the Puyallup Fairgrounds, the Portland, Oregon Fairgrounds, Santa Anita Racetrack, California Fairgrounds. They couldn't put barracks up in those facilities fast enough either. So the first several thousand people who went to those fairgrounds or racetracks went to the facilities or the stalls where livestock had been, or horses or pigs or cows. And they just clean them up, very rudimentary, and a family would have to stay where those animals had just been just shortly before. Finally, the concentration camps were completed. You can see in this map the different delineations. One thing I'd like to point out, you notice the pullout of the Los Angeles area and the Bay Area, those different colored regions. You would think it would be more logistically sound to just take 5,000, 10,000 people at a time and organize them and load them up to go to a certain camp to make it logistically feasible, easier. But they deliberately broke it up into communities of several hundred because they wanted to deliberately break up Japanese American communities. They thought that you can't cut the head off the snake, as they said, and so they wanted to break these communities up so they could not have means of being together, communicating each other, because they thought there were hidden spy rings. And here in Washington State, Seattle and Pierce County, went to the Minidoka camp. The rest of Western Washington were already at the Tule Lake concentration camp, and Eastern Washington, in blue, they went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The Bainbridge Islanders are first ones at Manzanar. After about a year, most of them petitioned to transfer to Minidoka, where, of course, all the Seattle people were. They had many friends and family who were also in those from that area. At its peak, these were some very densely populated camps. And like in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, it was the largest city in Wyoming at the time. And this is their peak population. Again, they try to make a camp life as normal as possible. This is a picture of Kay Sakai Nakau holding Bruce, who was born in Manzanar, Minidoka. And she just recently passed away. She was 100 years old when she left this. And as the war went on, the United States lost a little over 400, nearly 500,000 lives. And as was going, they came to the camps and actually asked the Japanese Americans to enlist and or join them, and they later were drafted. This is a picture of Art Kura wearing Flo. And he, out of the Bainbridge Islanders, 276 of them, 68 of them were either drafted or enlisted into the US Army, 68 out of 276. It was 66 men, 2 women, of which 18 of them served in the venerable 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was an all-segregated unit of Japanese Americans who fought with valor in Europe against the Italians and against the Germans. Probably their most famous battle was saving the Lost Battalion. This was a group of Texans, the Lone Star Battalion, if you will, and they're captured in the mountains of eastern France by the Germans. The Allied forces had, on 2 attempts, tried to rescue them, but they were not successful. The 442nd had just fought a 5-day battle earlier, had arrived to the scene. The commanders gave them 1-day rest, and they were told to go save the Lost Battalion, and they did. After a 5-day battle, they saved 211 out of the 275 Texans, but 161 of them lost their lives. They had more than 1,200 casualties, and 42 of them were captured by the Nazis. I bring the story up because this was a turning point in a lot of people's perception about Japanese Americans, because a Lone Star Battalion was so famous, these rough and ready Rangers from Texas, and these Japanese saved their lives. And these 2 groups, the 442nd and the Lost Battalion, to this day still have annual reunions to celebrate that. In the military, there's a thing called the Presidential Unit Citation, and about 5% of units receive this award for exceptional valor, whether it be a ship, a battalion, a group of fighting units, receive a Presidential Unit Citation. This is a picture of Harry Truman giving the 442nd their 7th Presidential Unit Citation. And on that day, he said, "You not only fought the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won." We were also at war with these countries, Nazi Germany and Italy and Japan. But again, there were no exclusion orders for all of these folks. It would have been something important for an Italian American like Joe DiMaggio, or this German American, Dwight Eisenhower, who later became was the Allied commander who led the Allied forces to victory, and also became a US president. This was an unconstitutional act, clearly. The Fourth Amendment, as I told you earlier, they had all gone through the homes without search warrants. Every home you're secure, you must have a reason to take someone's property. The Fifth Amendment is quite remarkable. So I've learned we're probably the only, if not the only, republic or democracy that has this written, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Other democracies, other republics give citizens' rights, not persons' rights. And this is an extraordinary thing in the United States, because if you come into this country, no matter how you get here, whether you cross a border at Mexico or Canada, or you get off a cruise ship at the port of Seattle, or you land on an airplane at SeaTac, no matter your country of origin, your religion, anything, the minute you set foot on American soil, you are protected by the Constitution. We just can't remove you instantly. There's a due process. You get a due process. Yes, you may be arrested for being an illegal immigrant, but there is a hearing, there's a determination of your status, and then there's perhaps a deportation, but there is a process. And remember, all these first-generation Japanese Americans who were denied citizenship until 1951, they were still persons. And the 14th Amendment is the equal protection under the law amendment, but it's also the democracy lottery, if you will. It means if you're born in the United States, you are automatically a US citizen. And 2/3 of these Japanese Americans were US citizens because they were born here. And even the attorney, this is J. Edgar Hoover. I told you about the FBI raid on Bainbridge Island, the FBI raids right after Pearl Harbor. They raided virtually every Japanese American home prior to their forced removal because J. Edgar Hoover had been surveilling everybody of 1/16th Japanese ancestry since the late 1930s. And every time a new child was born, the FBI created a new file of a Japanese American. And he had already been looking at all these folks. He said, maybe you're curious about a dozen folks, but he was more concerned about the German and Italian Americans, especially the German Americans, who there was an outright group in the Northeast called the Bund. They were Reich supporters and supporters of Hitler. And in 1939, a lot of people don't know that there was a standing room only rally at Madison Square Garden of Nazis. And he was saying, they're right here in front of us. Those are the 10,000 people that he arrested when this war went under. He told Roosevelt, I'm more concerned about them than I are these Japanese. And the Attorney General Biddle said, Mr. President, we're going to have an issue here because 2/3 of them, about 75,000 of them are citizens. These acts can't happen. This is a total violation of constitutional rights. And yet, it was upheld. There were 3 men who challenged the constitutionality of the executive order, Fred Korematsu and Minoru Yasui and Gordon Hirabayashi, but all of their convictions were upheld by the United States Supreme Court. So how were they able to do this? Well, you are no longer a person. This is the administrative orders, the Civilian Exclusion Order number 1 that was placed on Bainbridge Island on March 24th, 1942. And the instructions, and in the order, just in the introduction, it says all persons alien and non-alien. So you're no longer a person. The Supreme Court said you're now an alien, and the Japanese American citizens, their offspring, the children who were born here, were no longer US citizens, but you are now a non-alien. This new subclassification, which is simply in the administrative documents here, it's not even in the executive order and or any legal document. These are just the notices. This was one of the things that the Supreme Court would say, well, in times of war, there are reasons for national security and reasons for your declassification, even if you are a citizen. And this is one of the things that allowed the Supreme Court to justify the unconstitutionality of the executive order and the civilian exclusion orders. Let's remember this phrase. It's often misquoted by ancient history. And this is what you see at the Manzanar National Historic Site when you go down there. And you see this statement by Benjamin Franklin. You see the USS Arizona on December 7th, 1941, superimposed over the picture of the Twin Towers falling on September 11th, 2001. And this is how a lot of people reacted after Pearl Harbor, a lot of this jingoism, racist activity, and of course, after September 11th, this is how many people felt as well. This is taken on Beacon Hill in Seattle. This is at the Islamic Center in Dearborn, Michigan. Now, getting people to do things in war is unnatural. Unless you're a sociopath or a psychopath, we generally don't kill people on demand. So what governments know and what they have to do is you have to make your enemy much lower than you. And the Germans in World War I took it to literally a new art form. And they made the enemy look less human. You can see the Bolshevik here, incredibly dark and menacing, the gigantic knife, the German mother holding her infant, and the threatening look behind it. So that's one way to make your enemy look really evil, or you make your enemy not even human. Here you have the United Kingdom coming across the English Channel, and Uncle Sam is in tow by the web there. So we found these images and more so disgusting that we would never do that. We felt that we could go to war, but we wouldn't have to stoop to the level of making people so dehumanized and or making them not even human, because it was something that was not what we would have as a standard for our country. But after World War II started, and after September 11th, This next item I'm going to show you is something that's really popular. It might be the equivalent of wearing yellow ribbons or flag lapel pins. These were given by virtually every group, business, a school, organizations, churches, even our government. After about 40 years after the incarceration, in 1976, Gerald Ford, president, started on July 4th, 1976, he got rid of Executive Order 9066 on the bicentennial of the United States, our country. And that opened up a lot of people thinking about what happened here, including my generation. That year he was defeated by Jimmy Carter, and he started this commission to look into the wartime relocation, what happened during the war. Ronald Reagan defeated him, and he continued this study, this bipartisan commission. And in December 1982, they published this report, Personal Justice Denied. And after 2 years of hearings in 10 cities and more than 750 witnesses, this 476-page report found that there was no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage, nor was there any military necessity of the mass exclusion and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, but they unanimously found it was based on these three things. This started a healing within the community, started redress, started making this story more accessible to people because the country recognized that they had made a mistake. And in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which then led to formal apologies from the country, which led to hoping to have honor. And here on Bainbridge Island, we have to share the story of the Edwarders of the paper. Walt and Millie Woodward were a young couple in their 30s. They had just bought this newspaper. And in 1941, a few months later, Pearl Harbor happened. They put out an editorial that next day, like many papers, said, "These are our friends and neighbors. Let's not rush to mob rule. There's no evidence of disloyalty." When Roosevelt signed an executive order, he wrote a blistering editorial challenging the president, saying, "Have you not heard of the Bill of Rights, Mr. President? This is a violation of simple rights. These are U.S. citizens." He also had this editorial stance throughout the entire war, and he also had people write back from the camps, something that no other paper did, that had stories each week. He's the only newspaper in the entire country to do this, to have this consistent editorial stance against the president and the administration, as well as the only newspaper that has a story of what happened behind barbed wire inside the camps. And because of this, it helped build a place of safety. People from the Japanese Americans felt safe to come back to Bainbridge because they felt like this community had their backs. Plus, the majority had people look after their properties while they were gone. Out of the 276 Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island, more than 150 came back and had more been able to either find someone to take care of the property or been able to purchase property. We would have probably been well into the low 200s. There's not a community or a county or jurisdiction from Canada all the way down to Mexico that has anywhere close to 15% return. Many places like Bellingham passed official resolutions saying you are not allowed to return. Bainbridge Island was not of nirvana. It's all documented in Mary Woodward's wonderful book about their parents, In Defense of Our Neighbors. I think a lot of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, please take a look at it. It's really a lovely story about how this island is so unique. This is Mary Woodward's book about her parents, and we created this site for part of the healing in 2008, and this is the healing. So now here we are, marching down to the ferry on March 30th, 1942, the 227. We built a site on where they marched down to the ferry from Taylor Road. It's located at the former Eagle Dell Ferry Dock on the other side of Winslow. Here's the first introductory panel. At the site, we also have this timber frame pavilion, which was built in 2002. Behind it, you have these informational panels, which pretty much tell the story that I've just shared with you all. You walk down to the site and you see these 3 panels. And again, these are the pictures that the post-intelligencer took that day. That's why we have such a great documentation of what happened. You enter another timber frame gate. Here's the beginning of the wall, built out of granite, which is the solid foundation of community that granite represents for geology-wise, and our motto, Nidoto Nayoni, or let it not happen again. It's 276 feet long, 1 foot for every Japanese American who lived on Bainbridge Island. And you have this first introductory panel, which introduces people to this story that I've shared. All of the families are listed by their last name and their ages. This is Fumiko Hayashida. She's a very famous photograph of a woman holding her baby. This is the first panel, and on it says, I came to Bainbridge Island in 1908. Bainbridge was a good place to raise a family. Tomokichi Nishinaka. This panel above Bainbridge Island High School, as it was in the 1940s. I was born and raised on Bainbridge Island, and I'm a 100% American citizen. We will protect our flag, the United States flag, Masaki John Nakata. Over the baseball glove, it reads, just a week before we were to leave, Coach Pop Miller put in all of the Japanese Americans. Despite our errors and not hitting, he let us play the whole game. We lost 15-2. Above the heron, it reads, I felt like a second-class citizen to be herded onto the boat by soldiers with bayonets. It was the most humiliating experience of my life, Masami Nakao. Underneath the troop carrier's tire, we were really careful. We were prisoners, and they had guns with spears. Fumiko Nishinaka Hayashida. This image is a 3-dimensional image. It has barbed wire in front with the girl looking out. On the left, the quotation is, the searchlights played on our windows back and forth all night. I couldn't sleep, Masami Nakao. On the right, back home at graduation, they had 13 empty chairs on stage. That day, I felt so empty and sad. I sat on my bunk and I cried. Here we have a break in the wall. This is a wall about Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island, but for 3.5 years, they were imprisoned and in concentration camps, so that's why there's no wall here. It represents that period. In its place, you'll see this monolith that represents the Minidoka concentration camp. It's made out of basalt, which is the same rock that they have to build up the foundations and chimneys of the buildings at Minidoka. It's our final panel, and it's relief end. And you see, this is the relief panel. And this is the last one. You notice it's different for a couple of things. It's 3 together. So it's a diorama as if you're looking through a window. But also notice that we deliberately chose to have it all in color, whereas the other panels are relatively monochromatic. We want it to be in color because of the welcoming, the bright nature, the blue skies and water, the green grass and trees. The welcoming back to Bainbridge was something that we can celebrate in this chapter in history. The first panel reads, I was kind of afraid, but the neighbor girl that I used to play with came up and welcomed me, Ikyo Suimatsu Shibiyama. We put the farm under Mr. Raber's name while we were gone. When we came back, he returned it to us, Noburakura. My father and his brother worked so hard to build up Bainbridge Gardens. When we returned, there was nothing left. It must have broken him, Junko Harui. You leave the site, you come to a series of panels that the National Park Service developed for us. And I will just pause on that. I don't like people reading the quotations that they can see for themselves, so I will hold it up. No, they're gone. I'm sorry. Well, there are these 5 panels that are on here. You leave the site, go across the bridge, you come back to the pavilion, and these are our future plans for the site. We hope to have a outdoor amphitheater next to pavilion, a timber frame structure for a visitor center and a plaza. I'd like to note that we are building the Exclusion departure deck as we speak. It should be completed very soon, which is a 45-foot cantilever deck out into the Sound as if it was the first 45 feet of the former Eagle Del Ferry dock. Dr. Frank Kitamoto, who was 2.5 years old when he was removed to the concentration camp, said that at one of his last public speeches, this was the last line of his keynote address. And I think he's totally right. It isn't hate, it's fear. Fear is what drives people. You saw the propaganda earlier. We're living in a time of fear now. We're under the incredible cloud of a deadly pandemic and an economic crisis, and there's a lot of fear. It's being promoted as we speak by someone who should not be doing it. He should be leading our country, calling it the Chinese virus, signaling out people. And I'd like to share a personal story. I've been caring for a friend in Everett, and a month ago, I went to a store, Safeway store, came walking in, and these two men were leaving, and they pointed their finger at me and said, "You're the effing reason why we have to wear this effing mask." And I've been a long day. I've taken my friend into University of Washington Medical Center and another appointment in Everett. I didn't have time for this. It's 10:30 at night. I was ready to turn. I turned around to confront them, and they stopped. They looked, and they walked away, and it was two Safeway employees behind me. And they were being removed because they wouldn't wear their mask. They refused to wear their mask while they were in the store, and they're getting kicked out. And they said so boldly that they were blaming me for it. And I just wondered, what if I had shown up at that store 5 minutes later? What if they had met me in the parking lot? That's what is driving a lot of people. That's what drove people 78 years ago, 79 years ago, driving people now. It does drive us apart. And we are not living up to the model because too much of this fear is being pushed among us to divide our country instead of unite us in time when we really need to be united. So why our motto has not been lived up to, it's still aspirational. It's still a call to action. We must not let it happen again. Let's be like Bainbridge Island. Have people's backs. Look after your friends and neighbors and be there for them when they need you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, I want to thank you, Clarence. That was incredibly moving and a wonderful presentation. Are you available to take any questions from the audience?
Sure.
All right. And I'm looking to see, I didn't see any questions yet in the chat, but if people would raise their hand, or Asa, can you help recognize people who are asking questions?
Yeah, if anyone could just raise their hand or post their question in the chat, that would be great. And then I can unmute.
And I want to remind people as well that there is a speaker audience response form that Asa has put in chat early on during the presentation. Please fill that out. It's very important to Arts and Humanities and for Humanities Washington as well. So thank you. Clarence, that was extremely moving. I'm just stunned by the fact that during your presentation, it happened again. Is this your experience?
Well, no. I've given this talk. Thanks for mentioning. This is Humanities of Washington. They're my sponsor, and you give me the opportunity to share this story. And I've given this to thousands of people and throughout the state and other areas as well. And it doesn't come up very often. I would say maybe less than 5% of the time. And it's usually a question at the end where they try to challenge, well, we knew you were all spies or whatnot, and argue that this was totally right. I've only heard once before a lot of racist epithets like we had interrupted there. I think one of the reasons why they were emboldened to do it here was because, of course, we can't see them.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't know who they are really. See, and that's the fear and cowardice that happens.
Yeah.
They're not going to do that in front of the library and 80 people at Longview, or in front of their church when they're giving a talk or whatnot.
Yes.
Because of it's just not acceptable. But so this was actually kind of an interesting example of that, because it was these. I don't know who they were, but I'll bet you they would never say that to my face.
It's horrifying and inexcusable, and
they probably don't wear masks.
well, I'm sorry it happened. So we have some questions. I've heard of early roundups of community leaders to, I think, Hart Mountain. Did any of the Bainbridge Japanese American leaders get sent in these first earlier roundups of leaders to the Hart camp in Wyoming?
Yeah, there's a couple things there. I mentioned how they came through here on Bainbridge Island, and they took generally the leaders, first generation people. They were the school teachers, the ministers, business leaders. They were the influencers that they thought, again, they called it cutting the head off of the snake. And they went to actual Justice Department prisons. They were even the concentration camps. These are actual prison sites that the Justice Department had created. Hart Mountain was not the place that had what they called the resistors. It was Tule Lake in California. And Tule Lake was a concentration camp in Northern California where people were first sent to from other parts of the country. But then it became a detention center for people who were deemed disloyal. Didn't mention it in my presentation, but prior to the Japanese Americans even enlisting in the Army, even getting drafted, they had to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. And that questionnaire had two questions. It said, one, are you willing to fight for the United States against all enemies, foreign, domestic? And many of the young men said, well, no, I'm an American citizen. If you'll give me my constitutional rights, free my family from this barbed wire, yeah, I'll fight. But until then, no. And then the second question was, do you swear allegiance to the United States of America and forswear allegiance to Japan and the Emperor of Japan? And a lot of the young men said, I don't even know who that is. I don't know anything about Japan. And it was kind of a trick question. By forswearing, it implies that you had previous allegiance that you had. And so they said, how can I answer no to this? Because, and so these folks, and this was a tough thing. A lot of families said, no, say yes, yes. Don't show our disloyalty. The country already doesn't trust us. And there are some families that one boy would say yes, yes. The other one would say no, no. And if you said no, no, or no to any of these questions, you were considered disloyal and a threat to the country. And so they sent you to the Tule Lake Incarceration Center, which was a prison inside of the concentration camp, where they brought all these thousands of, quote, disloyal people. And if they were disloyal, they usually brought their families with them as well. So Tule Lake became, among the Japanese American community, there are people who have gone to their graves who were placed there just because that's where they were first forcibly removed to. But then when it became this place, a lot of people felt it was very shameful that you were being disloyal, that you were being answered no, no to these questions, and it had a taint that you were somehow one of these disloyal people. So many people would admit that they were there. They were pretty brave to do that because they were going against the tide of what the country was saying about Japanese Americans, and to bravely point out that no, I'm going to stand up for my rights. That was a pretty controversial stand, especially think about, I mentioned the 442nd and all the other people who fought in the war. My father was in the military intelligence service, which fought against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. And they were losing sons, you lose limbs. And how do you tell it to a family that sacrificed their son? And I get these people saying, I'm not going to be loyal to the country. So within the Japanese American community, there's a lot of friction within the resistors and the patriots, if you will, which only indicates that we're not a collective. It's a very complex story.
So we have another question. Could you please mention the book title again of the newspaper owners? And many people are saying, thank you for your wonderful talk, but
It's called,
there it is, which I believe you can get at the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum as well. Isn't that right?
Could you see that okay?
That book's also available at the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum, In Defense
Yes,
of
it
Our
is.
Neighbors,
Uh-huh.
the Walt and Millie Woodward, yes, Mary Woodward.
Yeah, please take a look at it, get it. It's a fantastic source material.
In Defense of Our Neighbors. And if you don't receive our newsletter and you want to hear other kinds of wonderful talks like this from Clarence, please register and you'll get our newsletter regularly. It and has been pointed out by Alina Matsumoto that In Defense of Our Neighbors may be available from your local library. Yes, absolutely.
And it's you can buy it from our website at Bainbridge Island Japanese American Community's website, BIJAC, byjack.org.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I do want to thank you for what has been an incredible presentation on your part. I found it extremely emotional. We appreciate what you've done for our community. You've told an important story. I think we all need to take a lesson at this very difficult time in this country. And what you do and your ability to reach out to people this way is so very important. I pray that you continue to do so. Stay safe, stay healthy. We need you.
Well, I do want to stay safe and healthy. That's important. And thank you, Linda. Thank you, Bainbridge Arts and Humanities, for wanting to sponsor this. I appreciate that very much, and appreciate what you're doing to continue, promoting the humanities and what really keeps our society what it is.